Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Saturday evening live of What Happens Next. We feel so honored and so happy to be able to bring this content for you every week with our second edition of What Happens Next. Today we have somebody very special, and I think we've been doing a few stories about it, and we've been getting a lot of DMs that we're very excited to talk to her. We have Amrit Gill here. Hi, Amrit. So thank you for joining us. She's the director of... Thank you. Sorry, there might be a slight lag, but we will try and not experience that. But Amrit is the Director of International Development at the Australia Council for the Arts. And Amrit, please do tell us a little bit more about your role and about what Council does for our audience from all over the world.
Absolutely. The Australia Council for the Arts is the Australian Government's arts funding and advisory agency. We are a statutory authority of the Australian Government, so we work at arm's length to support artists and arts organisations to operate and to make work. We work across all art forms, from performing arts to visual arts to experimental and community arts and literature. And one of the areas of the arts we don't work in directly is screen. There is a separate authority for that through the Australian Government. The area that I work in is the sector development team, and I run an international program with quite a large team of people who work on regional specialties and building connections between Australian artists and their peers internationally. One of our key areas of engagement is Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia and North Asia, and we've been running a program in those regions for about 5 years now, and it's grown exponentially and built a lot of really meaningful connections for Australian artists and their peers in those regions.
Fantastic, which is exactly what I was leading to for our next question, was that you have been really instrumental actually in implementing the first international arts strategy for the Council. Am I right?
That's right. I was part of the team that worked on implementing that strategy starting from around 2015. That strategy came out of a piece of research that Council commissioned in 2014, looking back and looking forward in terms of international engagement. So looking back at 25 years of investment, what artists were doing, where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do. And then looking forward, again at where did artists most want to engage internationally, what kind of work did they want to do through that engagement, and what sort of support they required from the Australia Council in order to do that. And what came to the surface was, unsurprisingly, there had been many years, decades of connections made with Europe and North America, what we would consider traditional markets for contemporary Australian work, but there had been quite a bit of energy built up, sector-led for many years, with peers in Asia, in many different countries throughout Asia. And being that it's in our neighbourhood, a lot of artists were naturally wanting to continue that connection and build on that connection. So we built a strategy around, I guess, supporting what artists felt were the most immediate priorities for their future international engagement. And that included continuing a program of engagement with our markets, but also building robust programs for support, engaging artists across art forms with their peers on a more exchange reciprocal based type of engagement with their peers in Asia. And that was I guess an evolution of what used to be a very transactional, export driven way of thinking international development, and moving more into a mutual reciprocal exchange based model.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating, because you said that it's grown exponentially in the last 5 years, right? How do you exactly strategize with growth with an international program like this, especially because South Asia is also a quite varied market too, right?
That's right. We've had to hone in on, I guess, specific types of engagement and specific countries as well, noting that the South Asia is very large, and it sits within broader Asia, which is also very large. And we have a certain quantum of funding available to us, so we need to be as strategic as possible about how we place that. And that really is about working through the right impactful partnerships between Australian artists and organisations and Indian artists and organisations, for example, whether it's a reciprocal residency or some sort of co-creation of work or a festival exchange, or an exchange of what we would call influencer or incoming visitor programs, for example, where we're opening up possibilities for work from Asia to be programmed in Australia and work from Australia to be programmed in Asia. So really making those very strategic investments and trying to make everything as exchange-based or reciprocal as possible.
So, for example, I'm just reading it here, but if we had a festival in India or an artist in India who wants to collaborate with Consul or with somebody, with another artist in Australia, how would they go about navigating this system?
Well, there's a few different ways of doing that. One of the mechanisms that we set up through our international strategy was what we called the in-market model, where we would have regional consultants or managers who were based in the strategic markets that we were trying to form connections and partnerships with. So we do have an international development consultant for South and Southeast Asia based in Singapore. And they work with a colleague based in Sydney who's also responsible for that region, and they use their connections, their wide networks and connections to gather that information, to share information with the Australian sector about what the possibilities are in India, for example, but also vice versa. Those individuals, their contact details are available through our website. Another means, though, is that we work a lot quite closely with the Australian High Commission, for example, who have very broad and deep networks, artist networks. People find us through their collaborators as well. One of the things that I'm quite proud of that we've done over the last few years with our engagement program, particularly in Asia, is we've mobilised and recognise the strength and the value that the diaspora in Australia has. Amazing groups of artists who are very, very well connected, who have cultural understanding and really great networks of artists and collaborators throughout Asia, and really trying to encourage the sector to work through their peers who already have knowledge and have connections and can make things happen and find inroads.
Yeah, fantastic. That's how we were able to also collaborate with a few events in Chennai, is through, Consul and through Nagarajan, and it's been quite fantastic engaging with the community and working with Consul, just seeing how, you handle different, because it's so complex, right? And we're all trying to deal with artists, but also the different layers of complexities in societal, art-based performance versus contemporary, etc. So it's really fascinating to see how you're able to manage and what kind of projects you choose to fund. I think from an outside perspective, it's really enlightening. So which really brings me again to the next question, is that you, in March, I think the Council set up a $5 million relief fund, especially for COVID, especially for artists, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think you have a few different slabs in the way you're disseminating these funds.
Yes, I mean, like almost, I think every arts council or foundation that operates, I think when we saw what the impact of COVID-19 were on the arts sector, the arts sector around the world was one of the first to shut down because of social distancing measures. We noted much earlier on, as early as January, a lot of projects internationally being cancelled because of the restrictions on travel, the closing of borders and the locking down of certain cities and countries. So we attempted to mobilise as quickly as possible, which is not the easiest thing to do in a bureaucracy, but within a few weeks we came up with a shape of an emergency response or an immediate response fund for the sector. And we grouped it in 3 different streams under, I guess, the overall title of the Resilience Fund. And that the fund is meant to be an immediate response, a short-term response for the sector, to make up for attempt to make up for the loss of income, which has been immense. So we have a stream called Survive, and they're small grants for artists and organisations to apply for stopgap funding to make the loss of income through cancelled work or cancelled opportunities, or loss of income through, you know, the loss of venue hire fees or travel, unrecoverable travel costs. The second stream that we created under the Resilience Fund is called Adapt, and that's slightly higher amounts of money, between $10,000 and $20,000, depending on whether you're an individual or an organisation, and that's to adapt their practice or find ways to adapt their operating model in this period where gathering and what we would consider business as usual was not possible. And that could be anything from moving into a digital space or turning a face-to-face residency into a home-based residency or a digital residency. So there are lots of different types of ideas that we've seen coming through that fund. And then the third stream is called Create. And again, that's slightly larger grants between $10,000 and $20,000. And that was really just to allow some sort of funding stream available to artists and organisations to keep doing what we've always funded them to do, and that is make work. The work, we don't want the work to stop. We really, that's an important thing. So those, that grant is due to close on Monday. There's been a very, unexpectedly, there's been a very, very big response from the sector in terms of applications, and we've attempted to get the funds out as quickly as possible. But it does close on Monday, and later in June there'll be an announcement from the Australia Council about what the next lot of funding will be available for application.
So I read in an article somewhere that immediately the Survive stream was the one that was getting the most, understandably, right? Because it's kind of a little bit of it's a shock response, and everybody kind of wants that immediate funding for setting up some basic systems at least. And so has that shifted? Did you expect that, first of all? And is the streaming or applications of funding changed to the others? Like you mentioned, the Create Fund has also received quite a bit of feedback, right?
You're right, early on, the volume of applications coming into the Survive stream was higher. And that, as you say, is because people needed that immediate support to make up for the loss of income that was ahead. We have seen over the last few weeks that the number and quality of applications coming in through the other two streams, Adapt and Create, has increased, which is what we expected as well. I think as the shock of, you know, coming to a halt in the loss of income has, it's not eased, but people have started to come into a rhythm of what's next, or how do I start moving into a recovery space. Then people have started generating ideas for Adapt and Create. You know, some people still aren't there, which is why it's important for council to continue to have funding streams available into the future. But we have definitely seen an increase in those latter two categories.
Fantastic. Great work. And it's so amazing to have the support of the council, especially I think if you're an artist, you know, it's not all artists have the blessing of being able to save a lot of money, you know, in their lives and through their art. So these kind of, I think, systems are really key to fall back on in times of crisis like this. That's fantastic. What would you say? I'm sure there are a lot of people who have applied. It's impossible to support every artist who applies to these funds, and I understand that because the resources are still minimum. What would be your words of encouragement for people who perhaps applied and not been successful, or certain things that you're looking for in an applicant that that artists can, you know, focus their energies on in these applications?
I mean, as with all our funding programs, I mean, anyone who's been approved to the Australia Council would know that we get many more applications in than we can fund anyway. So it's understandable that there is disappointment when people put their heart and soul into an application and it's not successful. I would say, you know, for those who are first timers, particularly to applying to council, it's really important to thoroughly review the published guidelines. They always go up on our website. um, review those thoroughly, to review the criteria and map out how you're going to articulate your application responding to the criteria. That's the criteria is what we use to make assessments. And then to make sure that you're providing the right kind of support material and targeted support material according to the guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Really think about the impact of what you're proposing to do. So it's not all about outputs, that is very important, but when we think about outcomes, we also think about impact on your practice, on the community that you're in, if you're doing community engagement, on your collaborators. Those are really important things. And as in anything, when you're unsure or you'd like to talk through any points in your application that you would like clarification on, we do have an inquiries email and inquiries phone number as well that's available on our website, and people can contact our artist services team for advice.
Fantastic. I really resonate with what you said about impact, because we do a little bit of grant writing work, like we were just discussing, and that artists, I think, always I think they find it the most difficult to think about that, because thinking about something tangible like an exhibition or a product is easier, but then looking at what impact that has in the long term, and why, funding this now for something that's going to happen 5 years later, or leaving a mark on the market is difficult. But definitely, I think that's super critical, like you said. So totally agree there. I also want to just shift a little bit about how artists are creating work right now and how our audiences are consuming arts right now, right? Everything is going digital. It's the stopgap solution right now. Some festivals are planning to go digital next year as well, because they're not very sure about funding and the costs are going to be pretty high. So obviously people are going to have to scale down in various different forms. But there are some, excuse me, some forms that are not necessarily, it's not easy to go digital. For example, theater. It's unless it's a well-produced show and you have multiple camera angles, etc. It's not a great viewing experience. I can't just go live on Facebook and just do a piece. It's not going to work. So, what would be your thoughts on some of these artists could cope right now? Those of them who are not been able to move their art digitally to access their audience or be in touch with their audience or connect with them. Any thoughts or ideas that you may have?
I mean, not all artists are, as you say, able to do that, and not all artists are comfortable doing it either. And I was listening to a podcast early on in lockdown about two festivals, one from Australia and one from the US. The Live Works Festival run by Performance Space, which is a Sydney-based organisation, and Fusebox Festival from Austin, who had a collaboration, a long-developed collaboration that was meant to be produced and delivered late in April in Austin, Texas, and obviously it couldn't go ahead, and they moved that collaboration, and Fusebox moved their entire festival into the digital space. Now, there's a recognition that the live experience can't be replaced, and I think that's something that's really important for us to hold on to in the arts, that being there, experiencing something physically is really, really important. However, there are avenues that can be opened up through the digital space, or through potentially even a pause to create, to reflect, to spend time with collaborators, even if it's not in the physical space, to perhaps reimagine a different way of working, another way of working, or just continue working, really. And I think the pressure can't be there for artists to just get back into it or to move everything online. So I think we need to recognize that there are many ways of doing things, and maybe there are some hybrid ways that come out of all of this that we might be able to hold on to, that may be sustainable, which is I think a small silver lining for us on the other side of all of this. We might find some innovative or some other ways of doing things. We might open up spaces for other audiences that for whom physical is not so simple. So we might find other ways of adapting our work for those audiences. So I think that removing that pressure to get on with it or to completely change, I think, and just for artists to find their own way.
Absolutely.
what's comfortable for them is important. And I think it's important that agencies like the Australia Council, who have a responsibility and who have a remit to fund artists, make sure that that funding is still available for those who do want to apply to create something or make something or do something.
For sure. I completely agree with you. But there's one more thing that if you talked about also being comfortable, right? And so there's one thing about being comfortable on social media or on digital platforms. And the second thing is actually adapting to it, right? And your firm being amenable to adapt to a digital program, a platform. So what would be your thoughts or your advice to people who have not been very comfortable with the platform? I ask this because, for example, some of my clients are very big companies, right? But the people who actually handle their social media are like the intern they hired last month or something, because they have bigger problems to deal with. They have fundraising, whatever. They have other things on their platform, right? On their plate that's more important. And for them, digital has never been, social media rather, has never really been a point of importance. And so somebody kind of takes care of it. Nobody even knows what content they're putting in. It's like that, right? In some situations. But I think going forward, and I think what this pandemic has really revealed, that the future is tech oriented, and we have to be able to translate a lot of our work, especially for museums and people like that, to be able to take a lot of their inventory and move it to digital quickly, right? So they have to digitize a lot of their items that they may have, etc., which in the past was not priority. But this, I think, has shown that going future, we all knew that it was, but I think what this pandemic has done is accelerated that very suddenly. And because we're not able to meet and work, etc., it's not a question of resources. So if you could have all the resources in the world, but that doesn't mean that you could actually go and do the work, you know. So it's brought about that accelerated effect of having to be on a platform that you were not prepared for. And again, not comfortable on, perhaps, right? Because everybody's trying to learn. What would be your thoughts on that, or your advice on how artists need to possibly start thinking about tech and educating themselves?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we see through our work at council that's needed. One is that capacity, skills and capacity to do that work, and that requires, you know, we've been looking at council how we can provide programs or some kind of support partnerships where artists and organisations can build their capacity in that space, whether it's through peer-to-peer learning or some sort of more formal learning model. We've actually moved a lot of content, started creating a lot of content in order to impart some of that knowledge, including a webinar series called Creative Connections, a digital support series through Facebook called Thinking Inside the Square. And a lot of organisations I've noticed have started doing this as well in order to boost the capacity of the sector, put ideas out there, and create spaces for dialogue where people can actually workshop some of these challenges. So that's one thing, that's that learning space that's really there to build capacity and skills. And the other space, I think, is also having the funds to support that infrastructure, whether it's through equipment, whether it's through hiring the right people to come in, having funds set aside to make content, to make quality content. You know, we've all, I think, seen this absolute flood of content online, and you know, quality control is really, really important. And I think that's where we need to make sure that we're supporting artists to transition into that space where they're not compromising their work, and they can be comfortable with what they're putting out there.
Absolutely, 100% agree with you. That brings me to another question that I think you'd be ideal person to answer, is really looking at leadership at this point, especially for entrepreneurs, people who are running any sort of arts business, small or big, is really the capacity to adapt. And like you said, you know, foresee some of those big changes. For example, for all the people who I know kind of saw it coming but didn't act on it in January and February because it was so unprecedented, right? The whole pandemic was, we know it's kind of at the corner, but it happened so quickly before we could react. And a lot of leaders at least have been talking about how they should have acted sooner, or or found out a better way, or maybe a support system in which they could have seen this coming, and they could have reallocated their resources and their time and their energies differently or better. And this always is there, right? As a leader, when do you know when is that time that you need to really shift your streams and your thoughts really quickly, and the institution or organization, to make sure that there's no dip in morale, art, the business, etc. What would be your thoughts or advice to leaders, especially with your position that you have a larger worldview of things, and artists and of the sector, right? What would be your advice to leaders moving forward into this post-COVID era, which is going to be very difficult with, I'm sure, loss of funding and resources, etc. Any thoughts and advice?
Well, I think I could maybe just talk from a few examples that I've seen that I think have been emerged, that I think have been really impressive sector-led approaches where leaders have come together, people who run organizations, independent producers, artists have come together in some formal and informal networks to actually start talking about how are you, first of all, immediately it was how are you coping? How are we all doing? What are we doing to pivot or to adapt? What are we shutting down? What are we scaling up? And, particularly people who run organizations, there are lots of different business models out there. Some are more stable than others. So it's been a good peer-to-peer sharing net space. At the Australia Council, we run a leadership program, and I know that those alumni have been mobilised to do that work together as well, and have conversations together. I've also seen a second stage of conversations come out through those informal and formal networks where people are talking about reimagining the future. So when we come out of this, when we start gathering again or performing or exhibiting again, or maybe when we're mobile again, are we going to go back to what we did before, or is there a shift? Are we going to start thinking about how we engage with our audiences differently, how we collaborate differently? And that, to me, has been really exciting. It shows, I think, that there are always top-down models that are largely funding related, but then there are these really strong peer-to-peer sharing networks where the leadership really shines through, and people share ideas, they innovate together, they create solutions. And I think our responsibility at council is actually to hear what and then create the support to then back that.
Absolutely. One of our other speakers said something that's really stuck with me, despite I don't know how many lives after that. She said, why would you go back to normal when normal was the problem? And I think that really stood with me, is why don't we look at this as an opportunity to better the industry and the sector? And also, this is a first time I personally feel like, in terms of content or collaboration, it really feels like you're working in a sector without any borders, right? I can reach out to anybody from any country and have new audiences, and so many new things that can come out of this, which we all theoretically always knew could happen. But I think we never had so much people who are using digital, like unlike before, where you can actually, like you said, mobilize some of those contacts and those networks, like even just our conversation today theoretically was always possible, but the fact that we actually did it and we're able to have this and share it with everybody else, is also quite remarkable. I just want to end with a question specifically about you. I think there's a certain power in seeing somebody from the South Asian diaspora in decision-making roles, right? And it's fantastic to see you doing what you do best. And I just wanted to ask you, how has the journey been, and what can you speak a little bit to the cultural diversity in your sector and in Australia?
Yeah, so I mean, Australia is a very diverse country, you know, that there are people from all over the world speaking many different languages. We have the oldest living continuous culture in the world through our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's always been a very diverse place, and particularly, I guess, with the Australia-India relationship, there's been an Indian or subcontinental diaspora in Australia since probably the early 19th century. So it's a long history. The sector is definitely expanding in its diversity. I think particularly in the last few years, you're seeing a lot more producers, artists with a level of prominence, people winning awards who are coming from our very diverse communities, and that's been really great. I think there's still a way to go. I think the more people you have at a leadership level, the more artists you have who are visibly diverse, it makes a difference. I think it shifts audiences as well. That's a new frontier as well. I think you know, as we're having more people working in the sector from the diversity of our population, we should be accessing those audiences who cover the diversity of our population as well. So it's a slower journey, but I think we're seeing more meaningful intercultural dialogue as well that's emerging from it. We're seeing greater respect of, you know, first people's first model through our sector, and we're seeing a greater respect for cultural understanding for what access actually means. And so it's really great to actually be a part of that. It's great to, you know, personally, I work in a team that's very diverse as well. So that's really quite wonderful, where you have this really fantastic, rich grouping of ideas that come together.
That's so good to hear. And I only wish you and your team all the best of luck to do all the great work and continue all the great work that you're doing, and as well as you know, reaching out to all of our diaspora. We actually had a project called Churning Waters that we also did with local artists, the diaspora there, and with Aboriginal artists from Australia as well. So it was quite fun and fantastic. And we spent a whole 15 days working with them. So when you were just talking about it, it just came back, and I was like, oh, I should mention that. But thank you. Thanks, Amrit. I really appreciate you staying up late at night for us to do this live. But any last words that you'd like to share with our audience?
Just thank you very much. I think, you know, we're in this really interesting time where it would be so easy to go hyper local. But I think what we realize is that everything that we're experiencing on a local level is happening in locals around the world. And so to be able to connect that up and be part of these conversations is really wonderful. I think, as you say, it's going to mean that we're thinking in a different way about what's next. We're not going back to the normal. We're evolving together. So
absolutely. Locally, but on a global platform. So it's very fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Amrit. And thank you, everybody else, for tuning in. Please watch out tomorrow. We have the Madras makers from Chennai who are going to be talking to our team member, Srinag, about their work and how they're managing with COVID, and what design in furniture is going to be looking like for the foreseeable future with this new lifestyle that we're all probably going to have. So thank you so much, and we will see you soon.